Everything on that flight seemed normal until the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A flight attendant strode down the aisle with sharp, purposeful steps, stopping at a black passenger's seat. Her voice was cold, her tone clipped. "Excuse me, sir, but you'll need to move. This is not your seat." The man looked up, his expression calm. Without hesitation, he pulled out his ticket and handed it to her. The attendant took it, her eyes scanning the details before her brows furrowed. Without saying a word, she returned the ticket, a flicker of dissatisfaction crossing her face. "I'll need to verify this in the system, but I believe there's been a mistake." The man didn't argue, he simply nodded and remained seated. Around him, passengers began to take notice. A few exchanged glances, some whispered among themselves. No one spoke up, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Less than a minute later, the flight attendant returned, this time with more certainty in her voice. "I've checked the system. There's an issue. I need you to move to economy." The cabin felt heavier, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words. But the man remained composed, his voice unwavering. "There is no issue. This is my seat." A hush fell over the first-class cabin. Eyes shifted toward the confrontation, curiosity growing with every second. A few passengers quietly reached for their phones. What none of them knew was that in just a few minutes, a single video would send shockwaves through an entire airline. No one in the first-class cabin spoke, yet the air had changed. A shift had occurred, subtle but undeniable. A few passengers exchanged perplexed glances. A middle-aged woman arched an eyebrow. A young businessman sitting nearby discreetly unlocked his phone and opened his camera. The man, however, remained in his seat, unfazed. He knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't the first time he'd been met with suspicion. But this time, something felt different. Linda, the flight attendant, stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing in displeasure. There was something in her posture, in the way she stared at him, that made the tension in the cabin almost tangible. She hadn't raised her voice, but somehow, everyone felt the shift. "I'm going to say this again," she enunciated, her professionalism slipping. "You need to move. This is not your seat." The man exhaled softly, sitting up a little straighter. "My ticket clearly states this seat number. You just checked it. I'm not moving." A few seconds of silence stretched through the cabin like a held breath. Linda clenched her fingers, irritation flashing in her eyes. A deep voice cut through the tension. "He already showed his ticket. What's the issue? If he's in the right seat, why are you asking him to move?" It came from a middle-aged man 2 rows away. Linda's head snapped in his direction, eyes flashing. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." The man lifted an eyebrow, leaned back in his seat, and said nothing more. But now other passengers were watching closely. More phones were raised. Screens glowed softly in the dim cabin lighting. Linda inhaled sharply and turned on her heel, marching toward the front of the cabin. She needed to check the system again. She needed confirmation. Even though, deep down, she already had it. In her mind, one thought echoed over and over: "He doesn't belong here. I know something is wrong." But in first class, the man remained as he was. His fingers rested lightly on the armrest, his gaze steady, not angry, not anxious, just patient. Across the aisle, a passenger murmured under his breath as his phone continued recording. "This is a story they won't be able to ignore." Linda's heels clicked against the floor as she entered the galley, gripping the company-issued tablet in one hand. Her mind raced with a single thought. "I know something's off. I know he's not supposed to be there." She scrolled through the passenger manifest again. His name was there. His seat assignment matched. No errors, no discrepancies. Yet something in her refused to accept it. Nearby, a younger flight attendant, Sarah, was preparing the beverage cart. She glanced up, noticing Linda's tense posture. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked cautiously. Linda pursed her lips. "There's a passenger in the wrong seat. I told him to move, but he's refusing." Sarah frowned. "Wrong seat? Does he have a first-class ticket?" Linda waved a dismissive hand as if the question itself was irrelevant. "I think there's a system error. He doesn't look like someone who flies first class." Sarah blinked. Her expression faltered. For the first time, doubt crept into the air. Sarah blinked, hesitation clear on her face. "But if he has a valid ticket, why are we asking him to move?" Linda arched an eyebrow, shooting the younger flight attendant a sharp look. "Sarah, I have experience. I know when something isn't right." Sarah didn't argue, but the way she avoided Linda's gaze said enough. Linda inhaled deeply, straightened her uniform, and marched back toward first class. She wasn't going to let this end like that. As soon as she stepped in, every eye in the cabin turned toward her. Some passengers had put down their books, their conversations now replaced with hushed murmurs. Others held their phones up, quietly recording. The man remained in his seat, completely unfazed. He was waiting. Linda stopped right in front of him, her voice firm. "Sir, I've checked the system again, and there is an error. I need you to move immediately." The cabin seemed to hold its breath, but the man's response didn't change. "There is no error, and you know that." Linda felt her throat tighten for a moment. He wasn't scared, he wasn't uncertain, and that made her even more uncomfortable. Her voice rose slightly. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to call security." A soft "oh" escaped from a passenger nearby. The tension in the air thickened. The man still didn't react. He simply closed his book, placed it neatly on the tray table, and looked up at her. His voice was calm, unwavering. "Go ahead." The silence in the cabin was so heavy you could hear the sound of breathing. Linda clenched her fists and turned on her heel, storming back toward the front of the cabin. But now her frustration had morphed into something else: unease. Across the aisle, a woman leaned toward her seatmate, whispering, "She just made a huge mistake." Linda marched into the galley, her mind racing. She grabbed the in-flight phone, dialing quickly. Her grip on the receiver was tight, her throat dry. "Jim, I need you in first class right away. We have a non-compliant passenger." On the other end, Jim, the flight supervisor, answered, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. "Non-compliant how?" Linda gritted her teeth. "He's refusing to move even after I told him to." There was a brief pause. Then Jim asked a question she didn't want to answer. "Does he have a valid first-class ticket?" Linda pressed her lips together. She knew the answer, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. I think there's a system error. I'm not sure how he got this seat, but something isn't right." "This time?" Jim sighed. "I'll be up there shortly." Linda hung up the phone, taking a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. Back in first class, the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers were no longer pretending to be uninterested. They were waiting, watching. The man in the seat remained composed, his gaze briefly drifting over the people around him. He was used to this, the silent judgments, the unwarranted suspicion. But this time, he wasn't alone. A passenger, a middle-aged man sitting across from him, leaned forward and whispered, "Would you like me to speak up? I saw everything." The man offered a small, appreciative smile and nodded. "Thank you, but I don't think this is over yet." And he was right. Minutes later, Jim, the flight supervisor, arrived. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair, his demeanor calm but authoritative, the kind of person who had handled more than his fair share of mid-air conflicts. He stepped into the cabin, taking in the scene before speaking. Linda was right behind him, her arms crossed, an air of victory about her, as if she had just found her strongest ally. Jim nodded at the man and spoke in a calm but serious tone. "Hello, sir. I'm Jim, the flight supervisor. I understand there's been some confusion about your seat. Could I see your ticket, please?" Without hesitation, the man pulled out his ticket and handed it to Jim. Jim took it, glanced over the details, then opened his tablet to check the passenger list. The entire cabin fell into a deep silence. Linda stood beside him, waiting for the confirmation of her assumption. But only a few seconds later, Jim looked up, his expression now stern. "I don't see any system error here. This is his first-class seat." Linda froze. "What?" Jim nodded. "The information is completely accurate. There's nothing wrong here." A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. A few passengers inhaled sharply, some casting knowing glances toward Linda. The middle-aged man sitting nearby shook his head and let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Well, I guess we all know what's really going on here." Linda could feel her face flushing. She tried desperately to find a way to turn the situation around, but the more she spoke, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. "But I'm sure there's an error. Maybe the system." Jim turned to her, his gaze turning colder. "Linda, that's enough." The cabin was completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Linda stood there, her body stiff with tension. For the first time during this entire flight, she began to feel fear. Linda was frozen. She wasn't used to this feeling. Throughout her years as a flight attendant, she had always been in control, always the one the passengers had to answer to. But now, everything was slipping through her fingers. Jim remained there, his eyes cold. He didn't need to say anything else. The truth was now too clear to ignore. The atmosphere in first class had completely shifted. Some passengers exchanged knowing glances. A few shook their heads slightly. Others remained quiet, still recording. The man remained seated, calm as ever. There was no smugness in his expression, no satisfaction. He simply looked at Linda, not with anger, not with mockery, but with quiet disappointment. Linda felt her heartbeat quicken. She knew everyone was watching her. Then, a voice cut through the heavy silence. "She's not going to apologize?" A middle-aged woman seated nearby spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Her question was like a match striking dry grass. A few passengers nodded. A young man suddenly spoke up. "Yeah, she was wrong, and she knows it." Linda felt the floor beneath her shift. She wanted to say something, to explain, to defend herself. But all she could think was, "I can't lose face like this." Jim exhaled, his patience worn thin. He had been in this industry long enough to recognize when a flight attendant was making the biggest mistake of all, not knowing when to stop. His voice was low, but carried undeniable authority. "Linda," he said, "return to the galley, now." Linda didn't move at first. She could feel all the eyes on her, every phone camera capturing this moment. Then, she realized, there was no way out. With her face burning from anger and humiliation, Linda turned on her heel and walked quickly out of first class. A slow, quiet applause began. At first, just one or two people. Then others joined in. Not everyone clapped, but the message was crystal clear. Linda gritted her teeth as she entered the galley, trying to shut out the sound behind her. In that moment, Linda knew. The situation had completely turned against her. And for the first time in her career, she realized some mistakes couldn't be undone. She walked quickly into the galley, fists clenched, mind racing. She leaned against the storage unit, trying to steady her breathing. But the sound of applause still echoed in her head, a painful confirmation that she had lost this battle. Outside the galley, first class slowly returned to normal, but the atmosphere had changed for good. The black man sat quietly, calmly opening his book again. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to fight. The truth had spoken for him. But this story wasn't over yet. Across the aisle, the passenger who had been recording from the start pressed the send button. Within seconds, the video began spreading. Inside the galley, Linda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from a colleague. "You're being recorded. The video is online." A chill ran down Linda's spine. Her hands trembled as she unlocked her phone, quickly scrolling through social media. And then, she saw herself. A video, less than a minute long, was spreading like wildfire. Flight attendant tries to kick black man out of first class, even though he has a valid ticket. Watch what happens next. Below, hundreds of comments had already flooded in within minutes. "Unbelievable. When will this stop?" That passenger handled it with pure class. "Respect. This flight attendant is about to lose her job." Linda felt her stomach twist into knots. She spun around to face Sarah, who stood in the corner of the galley, her expression uneasy. "Do you know who recorded it?" Linda's voice was unsteady. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head softly. "I think everyone did." Linda felt her head spinning. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. No, this wasn't over. She could still take control. Gripping her phone tightly, she quickly dialed the flight supervisor. "Jim, we have a problem. I need you to help me get this video taken down." On the other end, Jim was silent for a moment. Then his voice came through, cold and final. "Linda, you are the problem." Linda froze. She had never heard Jim sound like this before. This wasn't the voice of a colleague. This was the voice of someone about to make a decision she didn't want to hear. In first class, a young passenger held up his phone, staring at the screen before letting out a quiet chuckle. "Guys, this video is already going viral." The black man, who had remained silent throughout, glanced up. He wasn't surprised. From the very beginning, he had known this was never just about a seat on a plane. This was about dignity, about fairness, about respect. And now the world was paying attention. Linda felt like her entire world was collapsing. Her phone was still in her hand, but she could no longer feel it. Jim's words echoed in her mind like a blaring alarm. Linda, you are the problem. She blinked, trying to regain control. But the truth was undeniable now. No one was on her side. Not Jim. Not Sarah. Not the passengers. A shiver ran down her spine. For the first time, Linda was truly afraid. The black man glanced over at the passenger next to him, catching a glimpse of himself on the phone screen. Calm, composed, seated in his rightful place while Linda tried to remove him. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder, shifting from quiet whispers to open discussions. How many views now? Over 50,000. And climbing fast. This isn't going away. The man closed his book and let out a quiet sigh. He knew this fight had gone beyond the confines of this airplane. In the cockpit, a small indicator light blinked. The captain received a message from ground control. He exchanged a quick glance with his co-pilot before picking up the intercom. His steady voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. A pause. We are aware of an ongoing disturbance on board. I ask that all passengers follow the guidance of the crew to ensure this flight continues safely and on schedule. We appreciate your cooperation. A heavy silence settled over first class, but everyone understood the real message. This situation had now reached the highest authority on this flight. In the galley, Linda's hands were clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She could feel it. Something bad was about to happen. Jim entered the galley and quietly shut the door behind him. Linda spun around immediately. Jim, I can explain. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Jim raised a hand, cutting her off. His voice was firm, unwavering. Linda, you are officially suspended, effective immediately. Linda went pale. What? Jim didn't waver. When we land, ground control will be waiting for you. I suggest you don't speak to any passengers and remain in the galley. Linda felt like she was free falling into nothingness. She looked around as if searching for an escape, but it was too late. Outside, first class had fallen completely silent. Everyone knew exactly what was happening, and they were just waiting for justice to be served. Linda sat stiffly on the small jump seat in the galley, her eyes empty as she stared at the closed door. The plane began to descend. She could feel the change in pressure, but what weighed on her chest wasn't the altitude. It was fear. She had dealt with turbulence, difficult passengers, unexpected mid-air crises, but she had never felt this powerless before. Linda was no longer in control. She was the problem, and everyone knew it. In first class, passengers fastened their seatbelts, but no one had forgotten what had happened. Every now and then, eyes flickered toward the galley, toward the space where Linda was hiding. The black man remained still, unfazed by the curious glances directed at him. He knew this battle wasn't over yet. A nearby passenger leaned in, whispering, "What do you think they'll do to her?" The man didn't look away from the window. His voice was calm but firm. "I think they don't have a choice." The captain looked at the controls, confirming contact with ground operations. "Control center, this is Flight 472. We're preparing for landing. Any special instructions from ground crew?" A voice crackled through the radio. "Confirmed, Flight 472. Operations team is waiting at the gate. Flight crew is advised to remain in position until further instructions." The captain exchanged a look with his co-pilot. This was beyond their authority now. In the galley, Linda trembled as the final announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a full stop." The wheels touched down with a heavy thud. To Linda, it felt like a hammer striking her chest. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stay composed, but she knew the nightmare was just beginning. Cool airport air rushed inside, but instead of bringing relief, it only made the tension sharper. Two uniformed airline officials stepped onto the aircraft, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a woman in an official company uniform, walked up to Jim and spoke quietly. Jim nodded. Then he turned to Linda. "Go with them." Linda wanted to say something, to argue, to defend herself, to scream that this wasn't fair, but no words came out. She stood up, her steps heavy as she exited the galley. As she walked through first class, shame swallowed her whole. The passengers didn't speak, but they didn't have to. Their eyes said everything. She walked past the black man. He didn't look at her. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply sat there, calm and composed, with a quiet strength Linda had never understood. And that, more than any words, was what broke her. She stepped through the aircraft door into a world that was ready to judge her. Inside first class, no one spoke as Linda disappeared beyond the threshold. There was no need for words. Silence was the answer. The black man remained in his seat, watching the steady flow of passengers exiting the plane. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't seeking validation. A uniformed airline representative approached, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair, his expression serious but filled with respect. "Sir," he said in a low, measured voice, "we want to offer our deepest apologies." The man set his book down and met his gaze. "I don't need an apology." The airline employee hesitated, but before he could respond, the man continued, "I need to know this won't happen again." A beat of silence passed. Then, the airline representative nodded slowly. He understood. This wasn't just an incident. It was a lesson. "We will do better," he said, "and we start today." The man gave a small nod before rising to his feet, pulling his carry-on behind him. He stepped off the plane, knowing this journey wasn't over. In the distance, the afternoon sun stretched long across the runway. A new day was waiting. A new future was unfolding. And this time, it would be different. Life often puts us in unfair situations. But what matters most isn't how others treat us, it's how we stand up for ourselves. The man in today's story never had to raise his voice. He never had to argue. He simply let the truth speak for itself. And that changed everything. If you believe justice and respect are not privileges, but rights for everyone, share this story. Hit like if you think this story deserves to be heard. Subscribe to Aiva Stories so you don't miss more powerful, real, and meaningful stories like this one. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced something like this? How did you handle it? We want to hear your story. See you in the next video.